represents District 74, and he was elected to the Florida House of Representatives in 2018 and re-elected subsequently. He represents various parts of Sarasota County. Among the committees that Representative Buchanan serves on are the Environment, Agriculture, and Flooding Subcommittee, of which he is chair, and he is vice chair of the Agriculture and Natural Resources Appropriations Committee. I also want to welcome Zach Anderson, who's the political editor for the Herald Tribune, who has joined us this evening. To start our conversation, I have a question for all of this evening's panelists, so please respond when you feel you'd like to. What was your biggest legislative accomplishment this year, and what was your biggest disappointment? Please tell us about that.
Well, I can start. So I would think that my biggest accomplishment, and hi everyone, I'm Michele Rayner, and thank you so much for having me. I would think my biggest accomplishment is being able to pass House Bill 485. It is a workforce, it's a workforce bill that I ran with Representative Garrison, and it allows individuals who want to seek employment within the CNA field to have another route instead of having to do essentially coursework and go through school, that they're able to take an apprenticeship route and get paid as well. And another bill that I was able to pass is the urban agriculture bill, which allows local governments to designate areas within their municipalities as places where you can grow foods or have community gardens, and really curbing the food desert issue. So those were, I think, my two biggest accomplishments. I would say that my biggest disappointment of the session was the passage of the anti-trans bill. I was really disappointed to see that pass. And so that would be my biggest disappointment, one of them of many, but that would probably be one of my biggest disappointments of the session, along with HB 1 and SB 90. So.
Thank you. Perhaps Representative McFarland, you'd like to respond?
Yeah, I'll jump in next. And before I start talking about myself, I just wanted to congratulate the League of Women Voters. I saw the news this morning that the organization at the national level has just appointed their first African-American female leader, in Schoon, I think is her name. Yes. Cecile Schoon. Yep. So congratulations. That's a great bit of history that you continue to make in the 100th anniversary year of League of Women Voters. This was my first session up in Tallahassee, like Michele. I think my greatest disappointment, frankly, was that we were up there under the guise of COVID, which meant that the Capitol was largely closed. And so whether this meant that it was more difficult for us to get over to the Senate side of the Capitol to work with our Senate counterparts, or really just to hear from our constituents in person. I have some of my team on the call tonight. Many of you may know Becky Thornhill here in Sarasota. She did a great job of fielding phone calls and setting up Zoom meetings for me, but it really isn't the same. And I know League of Women Voters is always very active up in Tallahassee. I look forward to that changing next session when we return later this fall, the Capitol being open. Things I'm proud of from session: we did a tremendous amount of work on education and the environment, two things that are very, very important to us here in Sarasota. I served on the early learning committee, and I think, as Dr. Lewis Spector will know, the focus on early literacy is of the utmost importance. What the data will show is that a child's reading ability prior to 3rd grade is one of the greatest indicators of follow-on success later in life. And we really dove into the data and looked at some pilot programs out there to try to get a feel for what programs would make sense for us to put some funding and emphasis behind. And we did some really tremendous work, which I hope we'll get into a little bit as the discussion goes on tonight. And then secondly, the environment. Representative Buchanan chaired the Environmental, Agricultural, and Flooding Committee. And we really passed, I won't steal his thunder, but we passed some really groundbreaking legislation that actually puts Florida on the forefront of thinking about resiliency in a long-term way when it comes to sea level rise and flooding, and then also some things like water quality, but really, really tremendous, particularly for us being a coastal community here. But I'm so happy to be in office. It's a true honor to serve the state of Florida and specifically to serve Florida. So thank you all for your support, and I look forward to a great discussion here tonight.
Thank you. So, Representative Gregory.
Well, I want to say thank you for hosting this meeting first. It's a pleasure to be with you and answer the questions that you have. My biggest accomplishment or thing that I'm most proud of personally is something that is in the tax bill this year, and that's the outdoorsman sales tax bill. I take a lot of personal pride in that because that was mine and my staff's idea. That was my legislative aide and I sitting down last year at this time, trying to figure out what's the best thing that we could do for Floridians to get them to go out and enjoy the natural resources. This is pre-COVID, didn't have anything to do with COVID. This was just, hey, let's get Floridians out there, going to the beach, going to the state parks, going fishing. And how can we do that? Let's cut the taxes on things like tents and sleeping bags and fishing poles and anything that they're going to use in the great Florida outdoors. And so it's pretty exciting to see an idea go from literally sitting around the table at the office and then see Governor DeSantis sign it into law and get it implemented and know that it's helping all Floridians. Inside the chamber this year, as you pointed out, I was the judiciary whip. And so that meant that I had a big role in helping with both the COVID liability bill and the combating public disorder bill. And for me, it meant I was the designated debater for any amendments that we didn't want to see get added to that bill. So that was a lot of work, and it's satisfying when you do a lot of work on any particular project. As far as disappointments, I would say, look, there's always disappointments. This was my third year in the legislature. For me, the disappointing parts of it are when you think you have other good ideas and they don't make it across the finish line in any particular bill or in any particular year. And I think this year we made a lot of good progress on insurance adjustments that need to be made in Florida. I'm sure everybody on this call has seen their property insurance continue to rise faster than they would like it to, probably much faster than they wanted to. And the same may be true of auto insurance. So we took some big steps this year, but I think we still have some work to do to try to turn that tide around. And it's probably going to require some deregulation in the insurance market to do it. So thanks again for hosting this meeting. I look forward to more questions.
Yes. And Representative Buchanan.
I want to start by thanking you, Jill and Linda and the League of Women Voters for putting this session wrap up on to this evening. And, looking back, I think we had a tremendous session. We were able to accomplish some great things. One thing I was honored to do this session was chair the Environment, Agriculture, and Flooding Subcommittee, of which we had historic legislation come out of as it relates to coastal resiliency, a long-term cohesive plan to address that, with also a long-term funding mechanism tied to it. Additionally, we also passed some historic water quality legislation out of that committee, including the Reclaimed Water Bill. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss a little bit of this further as we get further into the evening. But I also want to touch on, for me, it's always incredibly rewarding when you have an opportunity, you have a local constituents, folks that live in the area that are able to bring you legislation ideas, and you're able to bring those forward without special interest involved. There were 3 actually this year that I was able to get across the finish line in the House and the Senate side. One in particular we had been working on for 3 years, and with a number of previous iterations, which was the homestead bill, of which increases portability for homeowners. This made its way into the tax package. Additionally, I was able to run a veterans preference and employment bill, of which I was with Governor DeSantis on Friday, where we did the signing ceremony for that, creating more opportunities for our veterans, upward mobility, and the opportunity for more diversity in some of our governmental entities. And then the third one was one we've been working on, myself and a colleague have been working on for the last 2 sessions. And this was an idea that was brought to me by the former Venice mayor, where they're looking to do a sailing school in Venice. And this was the anchoring limitations bill that we were able to get out of both the House and Senate. So I look forward to the opportunity of discussing those a little bit further. In terms of disappointments, Tommy kind of nailed it for me as well. Sometimes it seems like the most straightforward, a great piece of legislation that you might have doesn't quite make it. And, I did have a bill that I was really excited about. I thought we had a great chance at it. We were able to get it out of the House. But as usual, it went to the Senate and died. This was my telehealth for pets bill, HB 911. And, it was one this was actually a labor of love. We worked with stakeholders tirelessly to kind of reach the proper posture in the bill. And I thought we were in a good position, but it didn't quite make it. So I look forward to this evening's conversation. Thank you, Joe.
Well, you are very welcome. And it's great to know that, you're doing this wonderful service as our representatives, and you feel good about some of the work that you've done. And hopefully the bills that didn't make it through or across the finish line this year, you'll be submitting them again, and hopefully they will next year. So congratulations on all the accomplishments. I know that Representative Rayner needs to leave at 7:30. So I'm going to ask you some questions, everybody, that were submitted to us by members of the League. And we hope that you'll take the opportunity to respond to those that interest you. The first one is about home rule. The question is, this year, the Florida legislature took significant steps to preempt home rule. For example, building design in local communities, seaport regulations, alternative fuel options. Why has there been such a push to preempt home rule from the government that is closest to the people?
Jill, I'd be happy to take a first stab at it, if you will. I will say that question paints with a pretty broad brush. If you look at, for instance, the piece of legislation I just mentioned, the anchoring limitations area bill, that brings home rule back, allowing counties to designate certain areas as anchoring limitation areas. And another bill that I know one of my colleagues up here was very excited about, also had some home rule components, which was Rep. Rayner's urban agricultural bill. So I think, there were a lot of bills that were able to get done that were home rule oriented. But if you look at, the state, the state did bore local government. And so it gives us the opportunity, and I think it's warranted, that we have discussions around home rule and preemption, especially when there's instances where local governments overreach in certain ways. And I think there's a number of examples of that this session, and a lot of the bills that you referenced earlier were in response to some of that.
Okay. Does anyone else want to respond to that before I go to the next question? Okay, so let me ask you one about education. Governor DeSantis has declared that race and issues of racial discrimination will not be discussed in Florida schools. Education Commissioner Corcoran has proposed a supporting measure to the State Board of Education. That rule also would require teachers not deviate from the state's newly adopted academic standards. Given these restrictions, how will students have the opportunity for critical thinking and problem solving about these important issues? Any response to that?
Michele, I know you have to leave at 7:30 and you're going to want to address this question, but before she does, and it's a little bit off topic. I promise to come back to it after she has a chance to speak to it. But let me just give a shout out to the group, to Michele, highlight something that she did before we even got started in this session. Representing her district, she recognized that the COVID numbers and the vaccination numbers were askew. And it just as a simple matter of mathematics, she discovered that the Black population in her district was not getting vaccinated at nearly the same rate as other races. And so she took it upon herself, leaned forward, coordinated with the governor's office, got approval to go to a historically Black church, host a vaccine site, and reach out to all the other representatives in the delegation. So we met her there. And so I view that as a great example of her leadership, identifying a problem, finding a solution, and working, in a bipartisan way to make sure that, it gets all the support that it needs. And frankly, share credit with us when we didn't really deserve it. Michele did the work. We were just there to support her. And so that's the kind of legislator she is. It's been a joy to work with her. I know we probably disagree on this issue and she's got to go. So Michele, over to you to answer. Huge kudos to you.
Well, thank you, Rep. I appreciate it. And no, I mean, I will tell you, I think anybody on this call knows this about me, where we're able to find common ground, we will find that common ground. And when we're not, we just agree to disagree. But I think it's all mutual respect and love at the end of the day. And so I appreciate it. And on this subject, most of us I will probably be the lone person with my position. I know, and if I'm not mistaken, I think in Florida statute, it is actually in Florida statute that I believe high school should be teaching African-American history. So that's actually codified in Florida statute. Obviously, I think that critical race theory is important because you don't know, you can't, if you don't know the mistakes of the past, you are doomed to repeat them, right? And so I think that there is a way that we do need to be teaching about what happened in this country when it came to slavery, what happened in this country when it came to the indigenous people and what that looks like, and not in a way of, and what I know, the 1619 Project and all of the hoopla, I was brought up learning that because my mother always taught me. She said, "You have to know where you came from. You have to know the shoulders on which you stand." So for me, it's not anything that is just it's not abnormal. I grew up watching Eyes on the Prize. I grew up watching things about the Civil War. I grew up watching things about slavery because it was important to my parents for me to know history and to know the truth about history and to make sure that we're not doomed to repeat it. And I think in the same way that we have the Holocaust museums and how we can never forget, we have to be in a place in this country, we can never forget what happened. And I think that when we have a false narrative about what slavery was and about what Jim Crow was and about what the Jim Crow South was that my father and my mother grew up in, and we have this, this like fairy tale of what it was, we are going to be doomed to repeat the history of it. And so I think it's important for our children to know. I think it's important for children of all races to know what's going on, because not only will it help us understand, but it will help us to be able to move forward and heal some of these issues that we have in our nation. Because at the end of the day, I think that we have more in common than we have that's apart. But I think we also have to get real about the race issue that we have in in our nation. So was I disappointed to hear the governor's comments? Absolutely. Was I disappointed to hear the commissioner of education's comments? Absolutely. Do I agree with it? I do not. However, I'm still going to, without me getting like too deep, I don't understand. And to me, if we're not wanting to have a real reckoning on race and real reckoning on what's going on, we're going to be doomed to repeat the same cycles over and over and over again. And this country, whether we like it or not, and it's uncomfortable, we have to have a real reckoning on race. And it doesn't just end with Barack Obama being elected the 44th president of the United States of America.
Thank you for that. Any follow-up from any of our panelists? Okay, well, I
I'm happy to
hope.
jump in, Jill. You want me to respond?
If you'd like to, yes.
I'll just respond briefly and say that this is a hot button issue and really a cultural war that's being engaged in. So I think Governor DeSantis's point is we shouldn't use tax dollars and implement cultural battles and ideological warfare in the classroom. So we haven't passed a law that addresses critical race theory, and we might not need to. But I do think it's important that, especially at the K through 12 level, we're teaching kids how to think, right? How to evaluate problems, how to evaluate society. And of course, they should be taught the history of this country, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But that's one step. That's teaching them the basics in K through 12. And then when they get to college, they can have more advanced courses. But I think using taxpayer dollars to address anything that may be viewed as a ideological warfare or cultural war is what the governor's trying to avoid here.
Okay, thank you. And Representative Rayner, I know you have to leave, and I do want to thank you for participating tonight. So we will continue the discussion, unfortunately, without you, but thank you for your contributions.
Thank you so much. Good to see my colleagues on here. Thank you, League of Women Voters. Talk to y'all soon.
Bye, Michelle.
Bye.
Bye now. Okay, so I'm going to continue with some of the questions that members have submitted. One is on natural resources. First, congratulations on the $100 million that has been earmarked for the cleanup and closure of the Piney Point phosphate plant that threatened to flood hundreds of Manatee County homes in early April. The question is about HB 333. The Everglades Protection Area prohibits the Department of Environmental Protection from granting permits for the drilling of wells or issuing permits within the Everglades Protection Area. The bill passed the House committees, but died in the House State Affairs Committee, of which Representatives Buchanan and McFarland are members. Please explain whether you think this bill should be reintroduced next year.
Jill, I'll be happy to jump in and start with that one, as the bill did originate actually in my committee. And so, that was one I thought was important that we have a conversation around, especially, when we live here in Florida. The Everglades is a precious resource. You look at, it's entirely unique as an ecosystem. If you compare it, if you look across the world, there's no other place like the Everglades. And when we look at the idea of drilling through limestone, there's certainly some concerns there. So that was one reason I wanted to have that bill heard. We had it heard, and of course I endorsed the bill. It did make its way through another committee prior to State Affairs. And I happen to know that the chairman of that committee liked the bill as well. Okay, but what actually happened with that bill this was later in session. That was the last stop, I believe, prior to going to the floor on the House side. It had not seen its first hearing in Ag and Natural Resources on the Senate side. And so it was and that committee was getting ready to shut down. So it had died on the Senate side prior to or around the same time as it would have hit state affairs. And so I believe that's what happened with that bill. And I'd like to see it reintroduced.
Representative McFarland, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Rep. Buchanan just said. I mean, I voted in support of the bill as well. It's one that I would like to see again, and you know, perhaps work with our Senate counterparts to understand better what their issues were. You know, I do believe that more discussion is generally better on many of these bills that we work through, particularly ones that have such broad-reaching implications.
Okay. And Representative Gregory, you were going to say something?
Well, regarding that bill, I think James is exactly right. We were moving it through the House, but just the way the rules work, when we hit a certain number on the clock, certain number of days left in session, if it hasn't moved on the other side, then procedurally, there just isn't anything we can do with it. But as we've both mentioned earlier, you know, good bills have a way of coming back.
Right.
Sometimes it takes us a few years to get it there. I do want to, you know, just comment briefly on Piney Point. That was really a Tampa Bay region success. You know, the legislators on the call now in Sarasota and the rest of the people that aren't here, and the, you know, the representatives from Manatee County, where Piney Point is located, all came together. And I'll just say, you know, give you a little behind the scenes look. When the leak happened and when it became very clear that we might have a huge wall of water rushing, I would say Governor DeSantis responded immediately and decisively. And just so you know, behind the scenes, he and his office immediately started reaching out to the legislative delegations in these counties. And, you know, essentially the next morning at 7:30 in the morning, myself and Representative Robinson and Senator Boyd and some others met Governor DeSantis, and we were on his plane and came down here and went right to the site. He was all business. He was very engaged in finding out what the problem is, how do we solve it? And then he was glad that our delegation had made it our #1 priority anyway, because this was not a new problem. We've known for decades that this needed to be addressed. And so Governor DeSantis deserves a lot of credit for acting so quickly and so decisively. And I think it goes to show, and you know, it's related to this other bill we were just talking about, but you can look at a lot of the things the governor has done since he first campaigned to become the governor of Florida. He is focused on the economy, focused on water quality, and focused on the environment all at the same time. He really is an environmental leader for the state of Florida.
Okay, thank you. So let me ask you now about health care. Two Medicaid expansion bills, HB 341 and HB 443, that would help over 1 million uninsured working people in Florida, died in the Finance Committee. What reasons do you have for supporting or not supporting Medicaid expansion in our state? Someone answer that?
You know, we did actually expand Medicaid slightly this year. I wish Rep. Rayner was still on, because this was a project that I know is important to her as well. But we expanded Medicaid coverage for postpartum maternal care from, I believe it was only 4 months to begin with. It might have only been 2 months, but we've extended it to a full year of postpartum maternal care, which I think is, I was really, really proud that we did that. It was a priority of the House Speaker, Mr. Chris Sprowls. It was a priority of his. Many of you know I had my first child last year, and when you are in, you know, in that so many hormones, and you just, every breath your baby takes, you wonder if that's something is wrong, and all of these things that you worry about. And on one of my deep internet searches, I learned that Black women die at a rate of 3 times that of white women postpartum, even controlling for socioeconomic factors, which completely blew my mind. The United States ranks very low among developed countries for postpartum maternal care, which is astounding to me. And so when we formed, in November, and the speaker laid it out as a priority of his to address, I was really happy about that. There's obviously more work to do in postpartum maternal care, both for mother and baby. But I think that was a tremendous first step, and I'm very pleased that we were able to do that.
Do you anticipate any further expansion of Medicaid in the next legislature?
I would think it's unlikely. Nothing's sure in politics, of course. I would say it's unlikely, but we passed the Florida state budget grew by $10 billion this year over what we have passed historically, and in large part that was due to it increased demand for Medicaid services and an increased not services and quantity. So not only number of people on Medicaid qualifying for Medicaid, but also the cost of services that they needed. And that was a big part of our huge increase in budget this year.
Okay. So our members submitted some questions about specific bills that you guys have sponsored, and I'd like to ask them now. We'll go back to some more general questions after this, but Representative Gregory, you were the first named sponsor of HB 363, privileged communications made to Crime Stopper organizations. What is this bill about, and why should residents of Sarasota County be pleased that this bill will go into effect this year?
Well, I learned about Crime Stoppers both because I was a prosecutor for 14 out of my 20 years in the Air Force, and so I'm naturally drawn to law enforcement, law and order type discussions. But this is a really unique organization. Crime Stoppers is essentially an organization that collects anonymous tips, and when they lead to arrest and prosecutions, can reward financially the people that brought those tips forward. So they are a non-government entity. They are not law enforcement personnel, and they can create an avenue of communication to the community. So the community can be involved, and when they, it's people that are living out in the community that are going to know oftentimes before law enforcement are going to know, maybe where a criminal is hiding out, or maybe they're taking advantage of their neighbors. So if they have that information and they share it with Crime Stoppers, and Crime Stoppers shares it with the police, and they go out and arrest the criminals and prosecute them. So it is a way to get the community involved. Allow them to do it anonymously so that they don't suffer the consequences, because of course criminals don't like being turned in. This bill is important for not just Sarasota County, Manatee County, but really across the state of Florida, because it protects the anonymous nature of the tip. And if you don't protect them, then of course they won't be safe to come forward. It's a very successful program across the state of Florida. So it was just further protecting those people that are making the tips.
All right, thank you for that explanation. Representative Buchanan, you co-sponsored HB 131, Educator Conduct. Why should this bill be important to Sarasota County residents? What does it do exactly?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jill. In the state of Florida, there's been documented instances where there has been sexual misconduct between school personnel and students. And during the investigation period, these individuals, in certain instances, would resign, relocate, and turn up in another school in another district. And so what this bill this piece of legislation aims to do is it quite simply creates kind of an employment screening tool for the school district. It also creates a process by which there's a list compiled of disqualified individuals from being hired, and so it entirely stops this process, and it's something that I think was important and needed to get done and addressed, especially knowing that there's instances in the state where this has occurred.
So this is a kind of database then that gets developed?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a disqualification list put together that's overseen by DOE, and it creates screening tools for these institutions. It creates a hiring process, and also a resolution process. So if someone resigns, it's still resolved and put into the database one way or the other, the findings of that investigation.
Okay, do you know if this would be something that would be shared across states? So somebody with a Florida teaching license might be able to go to another state and teach there, even if they're in the database?
I'd be happy to get back to you on that, Jill.
Okay, thank you. Representative McFarland, question for you. You introduced legislation that would allow consumers to opt out of data collection by big companies that collect and sell data, and to sue those companies for data privacy violations. This had bipartisan and near universal support. What happened?
Thank you. That's such a concise description of a very technical and complicated bill. I should take you on the road with me.
Well, this question came from the members, so.
You have great members. I know what happened. It was a great bill. It was a very technical bill. Let me back up by saying, we seem to be very quick to demonize big tech these days. And that is another conversation entirely. With this bill, I think when you read that headline, especially as you so succinctly put it, I think everyone thinks very quickly to Facebook or Google and these big evil collectors of our data. But frankly, every single company transacts in data in some way, whether that's how you order your pizza or certainly shopping, particularly online. Or even, ordering new carpet for your house. The companies collect data about each of their customers. And in 99.9% of those transactions, that's what you expect, right? If you give someone your credit card information to buy that piece of pizza, you sort of expect that they're going to use that information for that transaction. And all of those things are entirely benevolent. Now, what we supposed in this bill was that all of that activity is completely fine. Even targeted advertising, all of these things are all completely fine, and in many cases make the consumer experience better, more delightful, easier, more convenient. All we're saying is that we as consumers ought to have more control over what happens to our data, who collects it, how they hand it over down the daisy chain of third party to third party. There should be some transparency into where your personal information goes, who has it, and what they do with it. And you should be able to opt out if you don't want to be a part of that. Now, I think some of the complication came because it was such a broad-reaching bill. Our legislative session, as you all know, is only 60 days, which is a very, very short amount of time to introduce an idea, have legislators really dig into the meat of it. We filed 3,000 bills this session. For folks to get very spun up and educated on the implications of each of these 3,000 bills is a monumental task. We had some disagreements with our Senate counterparts when it came to the data bill in particular, but I really do believe that we will benefit from having another session of discussion on this issue and ultimately pass a bill that strikes the right balance between preserving businesses and the American sense of ingenuity, and then also protecting the consumer's right to privacy over their personal information.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for such full answers on these very specific bills. So let me go back now to a broad question that I hope you'll all be able to respond to. This one concerns redistricting. New maps will be drawn for the 2022 election cycle using the 2020 census data. Florida constitutional amendments require redistricting maps be drawn without intent to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent that do not diminish the voting rights of racial and language minorities. Districts should be compact, as nearly equal in population as possible, utilize existing political and geographic boundaries while splitting as few cities and counties as possible. Would you support an independent redistricting committee to meet these goals? And if not, how do you see these goals being reached? So.
Jill, I think, let me just jump in here because we're getting asked this question a lot, and we'll have to break our streak of giving you good in-depth answers because redistricting is going to be before the legislature, because there are laws and statute and constitutional rules here. We really can't provide you any details at this time. And honestly, we don't have any data anyway. So this isn't something that we're looking into right now. The legislature will address it in 2022. And even if we were into it already, we couldn't share it because of the rules and the laws on this subject. So I think we're going to break your streak here, but give you the mic back to ask other questions.
Okay, so even the question of whether you would support an independent commission to look at redistricting isn't something that you can answer at this time.
I would save it for the post-session wrap-up.
All right. Okay, you got a deal. So let me ask another question then. This one is on affordable housing. A key funding mechanism for Florida's statewide affordable housing programs is the Sadowski Affordable Housing Trust Fund. This year, the Florida legislature permanently halved the state share of affordable housing money, using the rest on flooding projects and wastewater programs, reducing it, that is the Sadowski Affordable Housing Trust Fund, to $209 million instead of $423 million, which will have a major effect on disabled Floridians who have some of the biggest barriers to finding an affordable place to live. Would you support reversing this decision next year and restoring funds to the trust fund? If not, how would you like to see Florida support housing for the disabled and low-income populations?
Joe, I'd be happy to take the first stab at this. Just to be clear, I fully support affordable housing and know there's a tremendous need for it here in the state. Sadowski, something that's very important to me. And just so we're all clear here, how it actually works is, doc stamps is what funds Sadowski. What happened this legislative year is there's a policy change as it relates to creating additional funding mechanisms so we can fund some of our resiliency projects. Up to and over $100 million a year is what in time we'll be able to use for resiliency. And then the balance goes to wastewater treatment projects. And that was a policy decision that was made this year. I think it was important that we have a long-term cohesive vision for resiliency in the state. One thing I mentioned during session is it's very difficult. It's a difficult decision, but when we talk about affordable housing, the alternative is we could have some of these affordable housing projects underwater, if we don't have a long-term funding source to fund resiliency in the state. And I think there's a lot of other ways that we can also address the affordable housing issue, including increased density. In fact, we passed a bill this year it originated out of my committee. It was a reclaimed water bill. And one aspect of that bill provides gray water treatment for new communities in the state. And in exchange, local municipalities can provide incentives such as increased density for some of these projects. And so while I mentioned earlier, I think affordable housing is very important in the state. I think coastal resiliency is also very important, and our wastewater treatment and water quality is also very important.
There's a lot of things that make up the cost of housing, and a lot of things that go into making housing affordable. One of them, of course, is the state funding that augments it, but a lot of it is also what we're doing to the community in a more holistic sense. So how many of you in Sarasota, find yourself miles inland, but still living in a flood zone? Tommy mentioned earlier tonight the runaway cost of home insurance. All of these things contribute to the cost of housing going up. So while it may seem that we're diverting these funds away directly from affordable housing, which by the numbers we are indirectly funding affordable housing through investing in some of these more long-term projects. Now, I would offer a different perspective on this sweep to Sadowski. So you have very, very well-researched and excellent questions. Your members are just so informed. It's fantastic. You guys are following this stuff. But instead of this false promise of all of Sadowski being available for affordable housing, I looked back over some of historical years of funding, with 2020 being a massive aberration in how funding, but I looked over past years of funding, and Sadowski has always been swept. In many years, the ultimate amount of funding that went directly to affordable housing was far less than the 200 million, which is where we've now put the floor. So I would actually suggest that this is a good change for affordable housing, because we have set the ultimate floor below which you cannot go to fund affordable housing. And then the other 2/3 of Sadowski will go directly to long-term investments that will, hopefully bring down the overall cost of housing.
Yeah, I agree with Fiona. I think we should look at it as a victory, because as she's pointed out, legislatures over the past 20 years have swept over $1 billion from the maximum amount that could have been designated for Sadowski, but wasn't required to be, by Florida statutes. But now we are required by law every year. So every year now, the Sadowski funds are going to be receiving that $200 million, bundle of funds from general revenue from Tallahassee. So there's no risk of going to zero. Yes, your maximum won't be the 400 million or whatever that number would be in any given year. But I think a guaranteed stream of income is certainly better than being swept completely. And it gives the local organizations that work in this area more stability, a better ability to market forecast. And like James, I've been a big fan of these entities. I've actually been working with Habitat for Humanity for 25 years, which I guess ages me. And I also just rolled off a 3-year term on the board for Sarasota's Habitat for Humanity. So your delegation is engaged, both personally and professionally. And while a total victory, of course, from affordable housing advocates would be seen as, fully fund the maximum amount available for Sadowski, it just isn't feasible. And you look over the last couple of decades and say it doesn't happen. So I think really what we did this year is a big victory, because it does guarantee hundreds of millions of dollars every year going into affordable housing.
So just for clarification, does that over $200 million have to be spent on affordable housing? I know you said it's a guarantee, but is it guaranteed that it will be spent on affordable housing?
Sadowski was fortified this year.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, we are just about out of time. I have one more question that has to do with impact fees. Given the new impact fee law, which is HB 337, what measures will you take to protect existing residents from costs associated with new development through raised taxes or loss of existing government services such as road maintenance and repair or public infrastructure? Any thoughts on that?
I think you've found exactly the right audience to ask, how do you protect constituents against increased taxes? We would love to tell you about that. I think when it comes to impact fees, Jill, I'll just, almost continue my answer from before, which is what we've done by capping the increase to impact fees is create a little more predictability in the market for our developers and construction workers. It doesn't mean that impact fees can't rise. It just means you can't see a 3x increase from one year to the next, which any of you out there who've ever tried to budget or run a business, you know that puts so much uncertainty into your business model. So again, there are many things that contribute to the cost of housing. One of them is that pass-through cost that developers will pass through in housing prices. If it costs the developer more to build a home, they're going to charge you more to buy that home from them. So this is exactly what that bill was hoping to address. When it comes to increased taxes to make up, I think your question was supposing that there would be an increase in taxes to make up for the loss of impact fee revenue. Right. Again, we started off by talking about home rule in the beginning of this call. There are some cases, certainly, when the government closest to the people is the best, but there are also other cases where the government closest to the people sometimes makes almost emotional reactions through policy or taxing to try to increase revenue. And I can see that being an example entirely. My office has heard quite a bit about beach parking lately, and I was on another call with Representative Robinson, who has Anna Maria in his district, and he says that they are talking a lot about beach parking as well. And what we're seeing are local governments, local municipalities trying to limit the access to public beaches or preserve, this is just a horrible quote that I'm going to share, but the right sort of people are coming to our beaches. These are actions that local governments are taking, and those are places, those are times when, just in my one session up in Tallahassee, I've seen the state want to step in and preempt the local municipality's ability to, either raise taxes on our constituents or block access to public goods for our constituents. I think that's where you see a lot of preemption. That's the motivating factor for a lot of the preemption bills that we end up discussing in Tallahassee.
Well, we are out of time. I'm also getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. So I really want to thank you, all of the representatives, for your really full answers tonight, your honesty, and explanation of things that perhaps we didn't know about or that we were curious about. You've really done a tremendous job answering our many, many questions. I have a few more, but we've run out of time. I also want to thank you for sharing the important work that you've been doing with us, because we know it has been an incredibly difficult year. We've missed not going to Tallahassee. And I know that having that face-to-face opportunity is something that we're hoping will come back in the next session. We want to be there. I also want to thank the audience for their questions and for attending tonight's event, which will be posted on our website, lwvsrq.org, within the next few days. Everyone enjoy the rest of the week, and thank you.